The arrow struck the ground at my feet, its shaft still quivering in the hardened earth, fletched with the distinctive black feathers of Saladin's archers. I stood alone atop the crumbling watchtower of La Forbie, the last man living in a fortress meant to house 200 souls. Below me, stretching to every horizon, the Saracen army waited with the patience of vultures circling wounded prey. 3 days they had been there, 3 days since the massacre that had left my brothers dead in the courtyard, their white mantles soaked crimson, their prayers cut short by Damascus steel. I had survived only because I had been on watch when the assault came, only because Brother Matthias had barred the tower door from the outside before he fell, sealing me in, preserving one life when all others were forfeit. Now I stood in my prison of stone watching the enemy below, my sword in one hand and my rosary in the other, waiting for death or deliverance, though I no longer knew which I preferred. The siege had begun at dawn on the feast day of St. John, when we saw the dust cloud rising from the east like the wrath of an angry god made visible. We were a small garrison, tasked with guarding the pilgrim road between Jerusalem and Jaffa, with providing safe passage for the faithful who journeyed to the Holy Sepulchre. It was not glorious work. There were no great battles here, no moments of martial triumph to be recorded in the chronicles kept at the temple. We spent our days in prayer and training, in the endless small labors of maintaining a fortress in hostile lands, in the quiet brotherhood that forms between men who live and work and worship side by side in isolation from the larger world. I had been content with this life, or so I had believed. I had taken my vows 7 years earlier in Champagne, had sailed to Outremer with dreams of holy war and righteous combat, and had discovered instead that service meant mostly waiting, watching, the slow passage of days unmarked by anything more dramatic than the arrival of a merchant caravan or the distant sight of Bedouin riders on the horizon. Brother Matthias, who had served in the Holy Land for 20 years, used to laugh at my impatience. "War will find you soon enough," he would say. "Pray instead for the gift of these quiet days, for the chance to know your brothers in peace before you must watch them die." I had not understood his wisdom then. I understood it now, as I stood among the dead, as I realized that all those quiet days had been the true treasure, and I had spent them yearning for something else. When the Saracen forces surrounded La Forbie, we had known immediately that we could not hold against them. Their numbers were too great, their siege engines too many, their determination absolute. The Grand Master had sent word weeks earlier that reinforcements were coming, that we needed only to hold our position until the main army could march north from Acre. But the reinforcements had not come and the enemy had, and we found ourselves facing a choice that was not truly a choice at all. We could surrender and face execution or enslavement, or we could fight and die as knights of the temple, true to our vows, faithful to the end. Brother Matthias, who commanded our small garrison, did not even call for a vote. He simply walked to the chapel, and we followed him there, and we prayed together one last time before armoring ourselves for battle. I remember the smell of incense mixing with the oil we used to clean our weapons, the sound of Brother Thomas singing the Paternoster in his rough peasant's voice, the way the morning light fell through the narrow chapel windows and illuminated the dust motes floating in the air like tiny souls ascending to heaven. We knew we were about to die. We made our peace with that knowledge, commended our souls to God, and walked out into the courtyard to face the enemy that was already breaching our gates. The battle was brief and brutal. The Saracens came in waves, their warriors crying out to Allah as they poured through the shattered gates as they cut down my brothers one by one in the narrow confines of the courtyard. I fought from the watchtower, raining arrows down upon the attackers until my quiver was empty, then descending the stairs to join my brothers in the desperate hand-to-hand combat that swirled around the chapel entrance. I saw Brother Raymond fall with a spear through his chest, his young face still bearing an expression of surprise, as though he could not quite believe that death had found him so soon. I saw Brother Matthias fighting like a lion before the chapel doors, his sword moving in the patterns we had practiced together 1,000 times, his voice raised in prayer even as the blood ran down his face from a terrible wound above his eye. I killed that day. I killed men whose names I would never know, whose families would never learn what became of them, whose deaths were simply numbers added to the countless thousands who had already died in this endless war for the Holy Land. And then Brother Matthias was calling to me, his voice cutting through the chaos, commanding me to retreat to the tower, to bar myself inside, to survive so that someone might carry word of what had happened here. I hesitated, torn between obedience and the desire to die beside my brothers, but he was my commander and I had sworn to obey. So I ran. I reached the tower entrance just as a Mamluk warrior's blade whistled past my head, so close I felt the wind of its passage. I threw myself through the doorway and spun to bar it shut, but Brother Matthias was there first on the outside, his body blocking the entrance as enemy warriors converged on him from all sides. "Remember us," he said, and those were the last words I heard him speak before he slammed the heavy oak door between us, and I heard the bar drop into place from the outside, sealing me in, saving me, condemning me to live when all others would die. I stood there in the darkness of the tower's base, listening to the sounds of slaughter in the courtyard beyond, listening to my brother's death cries, to the triumphant shouts of the Saracen warriors, to the terrible silence that eventually fell when there was no one left to kill. I climbed the stairs to the tower's summit and looked down at the courtyard below, at the bodies of men I had loved like family, at the enemy warriors moving among the dead, stripping them of armor and weapons, taking what they wanted from men who no longer needed anything at all. I wept then, tears of rage and shame and grief, and I prayed to God to forgive me for surviving, for obeying when I should have chosen to die beside my brothers. For 3 days I remained in the tower, alone with my thoughts and my guilt and the enemy army that surrounded me on all sides. They made no attempt to storm the tower. Why would they? I was one man, trapped, no threat to them, slowly dying of thirst in my stone prison. They could afford to wait. On the second day, a Saracen officer called up to me in accented French, offering terms of surrender, promising that I would be treated with honor if I would only open the tower door and come down peacefully. I did not answer. I had nothing to say to him, no interest in the mercy of men who had slaughtered my brothers. I sat in silence, conserving my strength, rationing the small amount of water I had in my flask, and I prayed. I prayed the hours as Brother Matthias had taught me, prayed matins and lauds and prime and terce and sexton, none and vespers and compline, marking the passage of time with the ancient rhythms of prayer that had sustained the order since its founding. And as I prayed, as I spoke the words I had spoken 1,000 times before, something began to change within me. The rage that had consumed me after the battle began to cool, to transform into something else, something I did not yet have words for. I began to see my survival not as shameful cowardice but as purpose, as a responsibility I had not asked for, but could not abandon. Brother Matthias had given his life to preserve mine. The least I could do was honor that sacrifice by living deliberately, by seeking to understand why God had spared me when he had taken all the others. On the third night, as I sat watching the enemy campfires below, as I contemplated what I might do with whatever time remained to me, I heard a sound from the base of the tower. Someone was working at the door, trying to break through the bar that Brother Matthias had set in place. I descended the stairs quietly, my sword in hand, and I stood in the darkness listening to the scrape of metal on wood, the muttered curses in Arabic, the determined efforts of men trying to reach me. The door shuddered under a heavy blow, then another, and I knew it would not hold much longer. I retreated back up the stairs to the tower's summit, and I looked out at the desert beyond the fortress walls, at the vast empty spaces that stretched away into darkness. The moon was nearly full, painting the landscape in silver and shadow, and I realized that I was looking at a path to freedom if only I had the courage to take it. The tower's eastern side faced away from the main encampment, and at its base ran a narrow wadi, a dry riverbed that wound through the rocks toward the distant mountains. If I could reach that wadi, if I could move quietly enough, I might slip past the enemy sentries and escape into the wilderness beyond. It would mean abandoning the tower, abandoning my post, fleeing when every vow I had taken demanded that I stand and fight. But it would also mean living, surviving, perhaps carrying word of what had happened here to other Christians, to the Grand Master, to those who might avenge my fallen brothers. I did not make the decision lightly. I spent an hour in prayer, seeking guidance, seeking some sign that would tell me whether flight was cowardice or wisdom, whether I should die here in this tower or risk everything on a desperate bid for freedom. And in the silence that followed my prayers, in the deep quiet of that desert night, I heard no voice from heaven, received no miraculous revelation, found no certainty to guide me. But I felt something nonetheless, a small, quiet conviction that my survival thus far had been for a purpose, that God had not preserved me through the battle and the 3 days since only to let me die uselessly in this tower. I could not avenge my brothers alone. I could not reclaim Laforby or defeat the army that surrounded it. But I could survive, and in surviving I could ensure that their deaths were remembered, that their sacrifice was not forgotten, that someone would carry their names back to the world beyond this forsaken place. I gathered what little I had, my sword, my mail hauberk, my rosary, the small leather-bound book of prayers Brother Matthias had given me on the day I took my vows. Then I moved to the eastern wall of the tower where an ancient drain pipe ran from the roof to the ground below, and I began my descent into the darkness. The climb down was terrifying. The pipe was old, its mortar crumbling, its iron brackets rusted and unreliable. Twice I felt it shift beneath my weight, threatening to pull free from the wall and send me plummeting to the rocks below. But each time it held, and I continued downward inch by inch, my hands torn and bleeding from gripping the rough metal, my breath coming in short, controlled gasps that I feared might carry to the enemy sentries nearby. When I finally reached the ground, I crouched in the shadow of the tower and waited, listening, watching for any sign that I had been discovered. The wadi was 10 paces away, its banks offering concealment, its course leading away from the fortress toward the eastern hills. I crossed those 10 paces at a run, expecting at any moment to hear the shout of alarm, the whistle of arrows, the thunder of men pursuing. But no alarm came. I dropped into the wadi and began to move east, keeping low, using every skill Brother Matthias had taught me about moving unseen through hostile territory. Behind me I heard a great crash as the tower door finally gave way, heard the shouts of Saracen warriors flooding into the space I had just abandoned. Let them search, I thought. Let them wonder how I had vanished, where I had gone. I was free, and I was alive, and I would not waste the gift Brother Matthias had given me. I walked through the night, following the wadi as it wound through the broken landscape, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Laforby before dawn would force me to find shelter. My body ached from the battle and the days of deprivation. My wound from a Mamluk blade that had caught my shoulder throbbed with each step. My mouth was dry as sand from 3 days with almost no water. But I kept moving because stopping meant death, because the Saracen riders would be searching for me come morning, because I had a purpose now, and purpose gave me strength I should not have possessed. As the sky began to lighten in the east, I found a small cave in the side of a rocky outcrop, barely large enough to conceal a man, and I crawled inside and collapsed into exhausted sleep. I dreamed of my brothers, of their faces in the moments before death, of Brother Matthias standing before the tower door, of all the quiet days we had spent together that I would never know again. When I woke, the sun was high overhead, and I lay in the suffocating heat of the cave, listening to the sound of horses passing nearby, of men calling to each other in Arabic, of the search that I had known would come. They did not find me. I remained hidden until nightfall, then emerged and continued east, toward the distant Christian holdings, toward whatever future awaited me. The journey took 12 days. 12 days of walking through the night and hiding during the day, of surviving on what little water I could find in scattered wells and springs, of avoiding Saracen patrols and Bedouin camps, of slowly making my way across a landscape that seemed designed to kill any man foolish enough to traverse it alone. I should have died a dozen times. I should have perished from thirst or heat, or the infection that was spreading from my shoulder wound, turning the flesh around it black and swollen, but I did not die. Each morning when I found shelter and collapsed into sleep, I expected not to wake, and each evening when I opened my eyes again, I was somehow still alive, still capable of moving, still driven by the purpose that had taken root in my heart during those long hours in the tower. I began to see my survival as something beyond mere chance, beyond simple luck or endurance. God was preserving me, I believed, keeping me alive for reasons I did not yet understand, purposes I had not yet discovered. And so I walked, and I prayed, and I waited to understand what He wanted from me. On the 13th day, I saw the towers of Jaffa rising above the coastal plain, saw the banners of the kingdom of Jerusalem flying above its walls, and I knew I had made it, I had survived. I had crossed the wilderness and returned to the world of the living. I walked through the city gates like a ghost, my armor torn and blood-stained, my face burned dark by the sun, my eyes hollow from exhaustion and fever. The guards who stopped me barely recognized the white mantle I wore, so filthy and damaged it had become. But when I told them I was a knight of the temple, when I gave them the names of my brothers who had died at La Forbie, their skepticism turned to shock and then to something like awe. They brought me to the Templar commandery in the city, where the commander, Brother Arno, listened to my story with an expression that moved from disbelief to sorrow to cold fury as I described the siege and the massacre and my escape. "We thought all were lost," he said when I had finished. "We received word that La Forbie had fallen, but no survivors, no witnesses. The Grand Master believed every man there had died. I told him that they had died all but one, and that one had lived only because Brother Matthias had made him live, had sealed him in the tower, had given his life so that someone might remain to tell what had happened there. Brother Arnaud sent for the infirmarier, who cleaned and dressed my infected wound, who fed me and gave me water and put me to bed in the commandery's hospital wing. I slept for 2 days, a deep dreamless sleep from which I woke feeling hollowed out but clear-headed, my fever broken, my body beginning the slow work of healing. The Grand Master himself came to see me on the 3rd day, a stern old warrior whose face bore the scars of 40 years of combat in the Holy Land. He sat beside my bed and asked me to tell him everything, not just what had happened at La Forbie, but what I had thought and felt during those 3 days in the tower, what had driven me to escape rather than die with my brothers, what I believed God wanted from me now. I answered him as honestly as I could, holding nothing back, confessing my shame at surviving, my guilt at fleeing, my conviction that I had been preserved for some purpose I did not yet understand. He listened in silence, his hard eyes never leaving my face, and when I had finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Do you know why we failed to send reinforcements to La Forbie?" he asked. I shook my head. "Because we did not know you needed them," he said. "The messenger we sent to you was captured and killed. We had no word of the Saracen army's movements, no knowledge that your garrison was in danger. By the time we learned of the siege, it was already over." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle between us, then continued. "You think you survived by chance, or by Brother Matthias's sacrifice, or by God's will. Perhaps all of these are true, but I will tell you what I see. I see a knight who has learned something that many never learn in a lifetime of service. You went to La Forbie believing that your purpose was to fight, to defend, to die gloriously in battle if necessary. But you discovered that your true purpose was something different, to witness, to survive, to carry the truth of what happened there back to those who needed to hear it. Not every brother is called to die in combat. Some are called to live, to endure, to serve in ways that require a different kind of courage than facing an enemy's sword." He leaned forward, his weathered hand gripping my shoulder. "The temple needs warriors, yes, but we also need witnesses, chroniclers, teachers, men who can preserve our history and pass our wisdom to the next generation. You have been given a gift, brother, the gift of survival, the gift of perspective, the gift of understanding that service takes many forms. The question is, what will you do with that gift?" I had no answer for him then. I needed time to think, to pray, to understand what he was asking of me. In the weeks that followed, as my body healed and I regained my strength, I wrestled with questions I had never considered before. What did it mean to serve when service did not mean combat? What was my purpose if not to fight and die alongside my brothers? I had spent 7 years as a warrior, had defined myself by my skill with weapons, by my willingness to face death in defense of the faith. But the Grand Master was suggesting that there were other ways to serve, other forms of courage, other paths that a knight might walk. I attended Mass each day in the Commandery's chapel, and I prayed for guidance, for clarity, for some sign that would show me what I was meant to do. And slowly, gradually, an answer began to emerge from the confusion and doubt that had plagued me since La Forby fell. I went to the Grand Master and told him that I wanted to serve as a chronicler, as one who would record the deeds and sacrifices of my brothers so that they would not be forgotten, so that future generations would know what had been given in defense of the Holy Land. He smiled, the first time I had seen him smile, and told me that this was wise, that the order had need of men who could write and remember and preserve, that my survival would serve a purpose after all. He assigned me to the scriptorium at the temple in Jerusalem, where I spent the next 20 years recording the histories of battles and sieges, of brothers who had lived and died in service to the order, of the slow, grinding conflict that eventually saw us lose everything we had fought to hold. I wrote of La Forby and the brothers who fell there, ensuring that Brother Matthias and Brother Raymond and Brother Thomas and all the others were remembered by name, that their sacrifice was not simply a footnote in the endless ledger of war, but a story told in full, with all the honor and sorrow it deserved. And I discovered that this work brought me a peace I had never known as a warrior, a sense of rightness that I had never felt standing in a battle line waiting for the enemy to charge. I am an old man now, my hands gnarled with age, my eyesight failing, my body bearing the accumulated wounds of a lifetime in service to the temple. The Holy Land is lost. The Kingdom of Jerusalem exists only in memory. The great fortresses of our order have fallen one by one to Saladin's heirs. But the histories I have written remain, preserved in the archives we carried back to Europe when we finally admitted defeat and sailed from Acre for the last time. In those histories are the names of thousands of brothers who served and died, their deeds recorded, their memories preserved, their sacrifices honored by the simple act of being remembered. This was my calling, I understand now, not to be the greatest warrior or the most fearless knight, but to be the one who survived so that others might be remembered, the one who witnessed so that the truth would not be lost, the one who wrote so that the dead might live on in the stories we tell about them. Brother Matthias gave his life to preserve mine, and I have spent my life honoring that gift by preserving the memories of all who fell, all who served, all who gave everything they had to a cause that ultimately failed in the temporal world, but succeeded in ways we cannot fully measure or understand. I think often of that young knight who stood alone in the watchtower at La Forby, who wept for his fallen brothers, who struggled with shame and guilt and the terrible burden of survival. I wish I could tell him what I know now, that his survival was not a betrayal but a calling, that his escape was not cowardice but obedience to a purpose greater than his understanding, that the courage required to live and witness and remember is no less than the courage required to fight and die. We serve in the ways we are called to serve, and sometimes the hardest service is simply to endure, to survive, to carry forward the light of memory when all around us is darkness and forgetting. I stood alone, and in that solitude I discovered my true calling. Not as a warrior, though I had been trained for war. Not as a martyr, though I had been willing to die. But as a witness, a chronicler, a keeper of sacred memory. And in keeping that memory, in writing the names and deeds of my brothers so they would not be lost to time, I found a peace and purpose that all my years of combat had never given me. This is what I leave behind when I die. Not glory or conquest or fame, but simple truth faithfully recorded, lives honestly remembered, sacrifice honored by the act of witnessing. Non nobis, Domine. Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give glory, and to the names of all who served, all who fell, all who gave everything so that others might live and remember.